We are standing about 15 feet below the surface of the earth here in the Mount St. Helens area in a cave to talk about fossils. You understand, when people hear the word fossils, they immediately associate it with millions and billions of years. Beside me here, there's this gorgeous fossil filled with both nautiloid shells it's been dug out of the earth, polished to show the kind of creatures we find in the rock layers of the earth. But the question is, how did those creatures get there? I mean, nobody, when they dig a fossil out of the ground, can kind of put their ear down to it like a seashell, and if they listen really, really carefully, they'll hear it say,
"I was buried millions of years ago."
Nobody hears that. It's all interpretation. Now, how is it interpreted? You understand, there is a general series or sequence of things we find in the rock layers. Way deep down in the rock layers, we tend to find sea creatures such as this, or trilobites, or clams, or very heavy-shelled kind of creatures, or coral. Further up in the rock layers, we start to find fish with backbones, and above that, coal seams, dinosaurs, and then land animals. Now, Charles Darwin, starting in the 1800s, started to line this stuff up, saying, well, maybe a bacteria or a worm turned into shellfish, that turned into fish with backbones, that turned into amphibians, that turned into land animals, that eventually turned into all the creatures we find on the planet today. It's called evolution. Well, that's one interpretation, but it leaves out the only other possibility. You understand, the Bible spends more time talking about a world-covering flood than the creation of the entire universe. Now, what would have been happening during this flood? Enormous amounts of sediment would have been pouring off of the land surfaces as massive waves were washing over the land, and the ocean very bottom was being shoved up by lava pouring from deep within the earth. And what would have been buried first as this sediment washed down into the ocean basins would have been the creatures living at the bottom. Things like nautiloids, things like trilobites or coral. As the ocean temperature changed and there was extinctions by the trillions, fish would have been buried and trapped in the sediment further up. Land animals would have been trapped last, and massive amounts of vegetation washing around would have been packed down to form coal seams. See, it's the same rocks, the same fossils, the same order, but a totally different interpretation. One of them agrees with the Bible, one of them absolutely contradicts and rejects what God's Word has to say, so it has to come to a faulty conclusion. If you leave the truth out at the beginning of your search, you are guaranteed to come to the wrong conclusion. You're guaranteed to misinterpret the rock layers. You're guaranteed to misinterpret the fossils. You're guaranteed to misinterpret the time frame of all Earth history because you've left the truth out of your thinking. See, that's all that's going on in our schools, a misinterpretation. What we're going to look at in this episode is the most dramatic example of what happens when massive amounts of sediment flow into place and form new rock layers on this planet. It happened in 1980 in Washington State at a place called Mount St. Helens, and I think you will be fascinated by what we found as we examined this catastrophe in Earth history. The most significant geological happening in modern history, which gives us a model, an understanding of the kind of things that were happening during the worldwide catastrophe at the time of Noah, happened at Mount St. Helens in 1980. Now, to understand this event, I'm going to take you back and I'm going to show you what Mount St. Helens looked like before the eruption. This is a picture of Mount St. Helens. It's a beautiful resort mountain, over 12,000 feet tall at the time, a very, very popular resort area. Lots of parks and campgrounds and so on were used year-round in the area. Now, in 1979, Mount St. Helens became active. You see, St. Helens is an extinct, or was an extinct volcano in a range of other extinct volcanoes. Mount Rainier, Mount Hood, Mount Adams, Mount St. Helens, they're all right in the same area of the Pacific Northwest, the Oregon-Washington border, part of what's called the Ring of Fire. During the worldwide flood is when this would have happened. Split open, the fountains of the Great Deep broke forth, enormous magma and lava pouring forth, The volcanoes we see are the remnant of that. Now, in 1979, as I said, Mount St. Helens became active. Now, this excites the geologists, those geologists who specialize in volcano. They're known as volcanists, but that's their passion. And here in their backyard is an active volcano. Now, they moved in droves. I mean, dozens, if not hundreds, of geologists from all over the world setting up survey peaks. And they noticed as we got into the latter parts of 1979, there would be a small volcanic eruption. Just a puff of ash would come out of a vent and settle down as ash on top of the snow. At times there may have been twin eruptions and two little pits would form, and you can see the plane for scale. And this continued through November, December, January, February. By April, they had laser measurements of the surveying peaks on the mountains, and they noticed the mountain was essentially swelling about 5 foot every day. And the next day, it's 5 foot bigger. And the next day, it's 5 foot bigger. They had moved everybody out. Everybody was evacuated. A few people, one of the most famous, happened to have the name of one of our presidents, Harry Truman. He said, "I'm not moving out of here. I've lived here all my life." But for the most part, probably hundreds, if not thousands, of lives were saved. The eruption also happened on a Sunday when the lumbering crews were away from the mountain. And the direction of the eruption also saved many lives. So I think there was even a divine hand on this entire event. But on May 18th of 1980, as a survey plane is flying around the mountain and the sun is coming up on one side of the mountain, it circles and looks back, this picture is taken. The entire top third of the mountain slid off and slid down into the valley below the mountain. Now, it was a tremor that loosened this already swelling and weakened sediment. It fluidized the sediment. I mean, tremendous amounts of steam, 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit, and ash. It mixed and pulverized the sediment, the rock, the dirt, the snow was melted, turned it into a fluidized bed, a fluid substance, like a huge mud flow. And at an estimated 100 miles per hour, it flowed down into the valley. Now, there are enormous learnings that can come from this event. There was a photographer, one of the geology folks, on a ridge about 6 miles away from the then erupting ash and steam cloud that started to come out of the mountain once the top of the mountain slid off. And you can see the ridge you see the farthest away in this photograph is about 2 miles from the mountain. The next ridge in is 4 miles from the mountain. He is 6 miles from the mountain. Now, almost as fast as he can snap photographs, the gas cloud has now reached the point of a ridge about 2 miles from him. He continues to snap photographs. Now you see the picture he had taken where the gas cloud has reached his ridge, at which point he's turning, running, taking pictures over his shoulder. In subsequent interviews, he assumed he was going to die. He knew the heat and the force of this cloud heading toward him. Probably 600 or more degrees Fahrenheit, he would have been instantly fried. Miraculously, that ridge deflected the heat upwards long enough for him to be in his truck and drive down the trail and escape with these classic pictures of the eruption. Now here's a picture of the mountain in full eruption. The scope of this is what I want you to grasp. In full eruption, and it erupted for about 4 hours, there was as much energy being released by the eruption and the movement of all that material. I mean, think of the force needed to move the top third of a mountain. It would be equivalent to one of the atomic bombs that we dropped on Hiroshima exploding every second. In the next second, atomic bomb, atomic bomb, atomic bomb for 4 hours. That's the energy contained within this earth, and that's just one small volcano. This is a picture of the ash as it spread out across eastern Washington, into Idaho, into Montana, shooting high into the atmosphere and coming down. You can see the satellite picture shows a massive area of gray ash cover after the eruption had finally settled out. To put what you're about to see in perspective, and I'm going to talk a lot about that mud flow down into the valley. When Mount St. Helens erupted, if you could gather up all of that ash, if you could just form a big, huge cube, that cube would be about 1 kilometer. Now, in comparison, there was a mountain that erupted about 100 years earlier in 1883 in an island of the South Pacific called Krakatoa. When this island erupted about 100 years ago, it put out 18 times as much ash. So it was approximately 20 times bigger than Mount St. Helens in its eruption, in its force, and the amount of damage it did. When Krakatoa erupted, it shot so much ash so far into the atmosphere that it stayed in the upper atmosphere of the Earth for several years before the very fine particles finally sorted themselves out and came back down. That ash cloud spread around the entire Earth. Now, what happened at Mount St. Helens is like a single drop of water in an Olympic-sized swimming pool compared to what was happening all over this earth during the flood of Noah. You see, the Bible doesn't have to brag. It simply makes statements of truth and reality. And it says, during the flood of Noah, at the very beginning, the fountains of the great deep broke forth. Now, we know, based on just looking at the earth, trying to figure out why does it look the way it does, there have been enormous amounts of lava that have flowed from deep underneath the earth and then flowed across the face of the earth. A large part of the ocean basins are magma and lava that's poured out to form what's considered the most recent features of the earth, which are the ocean bottoms, the deep ocean bottoms. A large part of the Pacific Northwest is lava that has flowed out, and much of it, we know it has flowed underwater. The very characteristics, it's called pillowed lava, shows that it has immediately contacted water, or it flashes into a very porous shape or crumbles because it's flowed underneath the water. A large part of Africa, a large part of Australia. There's a single supervolcano remnant or caldera, that's the upper rim, left in Yellowstone National Park, that's 20 miles across. In evidence, there's been 3 such super eruptions. All of these things were happening during the flood of Noah, those fountains of the great deep. Much of it was volcanism. So there were 8 million times more magma, lava, ash, hot gases pouring out all over the earth, not just in one location, than in Krakatoa, where a single volcano changed the Earth's weather patterns for an entire year. That's the picture of Noah's flood to get in your mind. So with that idea, what you're about to see is just a little tiny model of the true history of this planet. Let's look at what we see had happened at Mount St. Helens. Now remember, this mountain is just a tiny picture of what was happening all over the earth during the flood of Noah. It shows this flood flow flowing down into the valley at about 100 miles an hour, and that sediment then settled down into the valley. But it carried with it enormously hot gases and steam and melted snow that was heated up to hundreds and hundreds of degrees above the boiling point of water, which became packed down into the ground. Now, as that sediment flowed into the valley, the ash settled on top of the sediment. That steam would find those porous areas and it would gather together, and over a matter of hours and sometimes days, the steam would burst upward and the land would collapse downward, and it would leave what were called steam explosion pits. Now, this picture shows one of those areas. It's a very large area at the bottom of the mountain. You see the really crevasse-y, erosion-y looking areas around the edge of this pit. Well, that's where the land collapsed downward while the steam burst upward, leaving this very craggy looking pattern. Now, those who have ever traveled anywhere in the western United States or out in areas where there's lots of rainfall, you will see this erosional pattern where water will rain and it'll carry away sand and it's riverbeds and streams, and they'll form these erosional gullies. Now, geologists are trained to think in a certain way as they go through school. They're trained to think in terms of slow, gradual current processes. They have a term called uniformitarianism. The present is the key to the past. Things we see happening today are the key to understanding what happened in the past. Well, in reality, that's just a philosophy. That's the opposite of what God would have us think. He says, remember what I have done. You see, enormous events, which are true realities of history in the past, are the key to understanding why the world looks the way it does in the present. Well, they're even taught to think, as they look at pictures like this, in a certain way. It's even given a name, the dendritic drainage pattern. And then they see this pattern, they think in terms of huge periods of time, maybe hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of years of slow, gradual erosion could form an entire new, very crevicey, craggy, eroded looking surface like this. Except guess what? It happened in a matter of seconds. The steam burst upward, the land collapsed downward, and there is that very erosional looking pattern. But it wasn't erosion. It was a catastrophic event that created it. Well, there were other steam explosion pits. In this picture you see a small one and then another one and then another one, and they happen to be in line. Well, that sediment that flowed down into the valley, within months it had turned back to solid rock. Just like you could pour concrete and it's a liquid, it's a very thick muddy slurry, and within a day you can hit it with a hammer. It is a rock type substance again. Things within the lava and the dirt and the lime, whatever happened to be making up the granite particles, they re-cemented the rock into a fairly hard consolidated surface, new rock layer. But about 4 months after the initial eruption, there was another mudslide. Unstable material slid down into the valley, and it hit pit after pit after pit filled with water, broke through, and there was another much smaller, little catastrophic, rapid event that carved out an entire new river valley that had not existed before this mudslide. So now for the first time, scientists could look and see what did that sediment look like that flowed down into the valley at 100 miles an hour. Now I would envision like taking a bunch of mashed potatoes and putting a blender in them and just blending them all up, and you'd have this big conglomerate mixed up mess that used to be the top of the mountain. But to their amazement, this is not what they found. At 100 miles an hour or more, that catastrophic mud flow event sorted that sediment into different particle sizes, different materials, different densities, different sediments, and all up and down the New River Valley in perfectly flat horizontal lines, layer laid upon layer laid upon layer, you see new layers of sediment, new laminar seams, very flat with no sign of any erosion or up or down movement in between these very distinct layers. As a matter of fact, as you go closer and closer, right down to the little 1/16 of an inch or millimeter thick layers, and they're called varves as the geologists study these things, you find them perfectly smooth and flat, laid down in a flow direction, running as far as you can see in these directions. Now, geologists are trained to think in a certain way. They see these little tiny layers, whether they're a sediment seam or a varve or whatever, and they'll say, well, how did these form? Well, what do we see happening today? Maybe slow sediment at the bottom of a calm ocean bay, or a lake with things dying and dropping to the bottom. And maybe over a season, a year, a winter, summer season, a small layer of sediment will form. And if you count 100,000 of these, that must represent 100,000 years of Earth history. And it will literally be reported as if it is a fact. There's the 100,000 varves, must be 100,000 years of Earth history. There's 100,000 layers in an ice core, must be 100,000 years taken to form that ice core. It's the way they're taught to think, except it didn't take 100,000 years. You see, at 100 miles an hour, that flow flows down into the valley, it sorts things out, it lays them out in horizontal layers, it creates the varves in a matter of hours, not years, decades, centuries, millennium. That's the reality of what we see as we look at these things from Mount St. Helens. And then you have this little tiny river left at the bottom of this very large gorge that was gorged out by a mud flow, and the mud just flowed on downstream and got distributed miles away down at the bottom of the valley. But the little tiny river did not carve out the valley. Someone that didn't see this event might look at that and say, wow, it must have taken millions of years for that little creek to have carried away all that sediment. No, it was a catastrophic event that created the new riverbed. The river didn't carve out the valley, the catastrophe carved out the valley and left the river. It's 600 feet of sediment that was laid down and carved out. The Grand Canyon is 6,000 feet deep. but it's the same principle. And as you look at the layers, they're perfectly flat horizontal layers, showing no sign of enormous period of millions and millions of years in between the layers, because there would be all sorts of erosion and ruts and up and down contours if the time had passed. No, those layers were laid down sequentially, one after another, in a catastrophic, world-covering flood flow event. Now, another thing that happened during this catastrophe, remember I said the mud flowed down into the valley? Here's a picture of what's found at the bottom of this valley facing where that mud was sliding toward. That lake you see is called Spirit Lake. So it was just a beautiful, pristine mountain lake at very high elevations at Mount St. Helens. Well, the mud, as it slid down into the valley, and this is just a pure estimate, maybe a third of it split and went past a ridge and slid into that lake. The other part of the mud, it flowed down the valley, filling it about 600 feet deep, and as the subsequent mud flow broke through, forming this new river valley, it formed the North Fork of the New Toutle River that didn't even exist before this catastrophe. But back to that lake, that mud sliding down, that sediment, and slamming into that water at expressway speeds, it created a tidal wave of unimaginable power, slamming that water forward at that same speed, hitting those surrounding cliffs with a wave of water at least 200 to 300 feet high. You see, this lake sits in a bowl surrounded by all of these cliffs. They were covered with lush trees. We're talking a pristine forest of logs that were 3, 4, 5 feet in diameter that had grown there for hundreds of years. Well over 1 million trees were ripped up right down to their root bundles, right through all of the soil layers, all the way down to solid basalt, just carving a erosional rut in this very hard rock and flushing all that stuff back down into the lake, leaving at least 1 million trees floating in this lake. Now, over the subsequent months and years, these trees are just moving back and forth and bumping up against each other and abrading, getting waterlogged, eventually many of them dropping to the lake bottom, an enormous floating vegetation mat. Now, what does this have to do with the Bible, with world history, with determining whether Noah's flood was real and what's the real history of this planet? Now, that brings us to an entirely new topic. In every museum you'll walk into that talks about Earth history, there'll be a section talking about either dinosaurs or coal formation. You'll be taught that the entire Earth was covered with swamps at one time. Now, why is that? And when you see pictures of dinosaurs, you'll often see them kind of wandering around in ancient swamps and so on. Well, this is why. To form coal, a tree or vegetation or plants or leaves or something has to die, but then it has to be buried extremely rapidly to keep away oxygen and microorganisms, or else they're going to turn it back into soil. You don't see a tree dying in a forest and you come back years later and there's a hunk of coal laying there in the forest. No, it degrades back into soil, which turns into nutrients so more trees can grow. But there's one place where when trees die, they don't turn back into soil, and that's in swamps. Swamps are very acidic. Trees laying at the bottom of swamps, they will turn into a very high carbon material called peat, but it won't degrade back into soil. And all it takes to form coal is to take organic matter along with some clay that can act as a catalyst and compress it at high temperature, and the pressure will cause the high temperature. Within hours, you'll have a hunk of coal. So we know how coal forms, but the Earth is covered with coal. So as a conclusion, scientists teach us a fact that at one period of the Earth's history, it was covered with swamps to explain all the coal. But there's a problem. You see, when you look at coal, and I'm old enough to have remembered coal being delivered to our home, and it would get dumped out and it would just break apart in sheets and pieces that were layered, layer after layer, and they'd fall apart in these very sheet-like compressed, compact designs. And when coal is dug up, you'll see it lay down in sheets. It doesn't look that way when you drain a peat swamp. Here's a picture. This black material is the organic material that used to be alive in the swamp, but all these roots are digging down through the peat and there's worms and stuff burrowing in it, And it is like a blender blending it all up. So it is not layered in very distinct layers. It's all just one uniform mess all mixed together. And yet coal doesn't look that way. Now that's a clue. When you see problems and anomalies, it means you must not have the whole truth. You see, the characteristics of coal do not match the characteristics of a swamp. So how can we say swamp peat turned into coal? Well, Steve Austin is a researcher at the University of Pennsylvania in the 1970s, getting his PhD. He happened to be a very strong Christian that believed in a worldwide flood, and it gave him this idea. Maybe there were enormous floating mats of vegetation floating around after the flood. It ripped up everything on this planet. Nothing could have survived those floodwaters. And these mats of vegetation, as they became waterlogged and abraded against themselves, different things would drop down and form a very layered layer of organic matter, which when compressed would form a very sheet-like coal bed that would come apart in distinct layers. He collected a lot of data, presented his findings to get his PhD. Now he'd done good work. He ended up being awarded his PhD in geology, but they had a couple objections as they looked at what he had found. The first objection was they showed a map of which really seems to be a single coal seam, very rich, high concentrations of coal in the dark, very low grade coal material, brown coal, just in low quantities in the gray, that seems to run all the way from Alaska down into Mexico, covering an entire continental area. And one of their main comments was, well, we see your model. It explains why coal looks the way it does. It's good technical scientific work, but we know it can't be true, because for there be a floating mat of vegetation that would have created coal of this enormous extent, the entire Earth would have had to have been covered by water at one time. And we all know the Earth has never been covered by water. You see, it's their preconceptions that drove their conclusion instead of allowing the data to drive their conclusions. There is enormous supporting evidence that the Bible means what it says. Coal is there because of this worldwide flood. Rock layers look the way they do because of the worldwide flood. The sediment layers are there and the characteristics they have because of the worldwide flood. Enormous canyons like the Grand Canyon are there because of enormous flow that eroded away sediment laid down during the flood as the flow flowed off the land or subsequently dug out these eroded pits. Now, Steve Austin got his PhD in 1979. In 1980, Mount St. Helens erupts, and you end up with 1 million trees floating on a body of water as an enormous floating vegetation mat. Now this is once again a drop of water in an Olympic swimming pool compared to the whole Earth, but it's a model to study and understand things. Which, by the way, was the other objection the board of the PhD inquiry had as he's defending his thesis. They said, well, we don't see any models of huge floating vegetation mats, so you got to have a model in science in order to know the data fits your theory. Well, here was the model, floating vegetation mat on Spirit Lake at Mount St. Helens. So here's a picture of Steve Austin and his diving buddy. The mountain is still smoking in the background, and he is scuba diving in the midst of the 1 million floating trees on Spirit Lake to see just what does he see underneath these trees. He looks up, he sees all of these trees above him, and below him is layer after layer after layer after layer of waterlogged, sunken organic matter, many feet deep. And all it would take is another just massive sediment flow event that compressing it under enormous amounts of heat and pressure to turn this exact peat layer into a coal seam. God has told us in advance what we would face on this earth. There is a key verse in the book of 2 Peter 3, starting with verse 3. It says, in the last day, scoffers will come, saying, everything has continued as it has since our fathers fell asleep. Now that's just a way of thinking. That's a philosophical viewpoint. everything's happened in the way in the past, the same way we see it happening today, it'll just keep happening in that way in the future. There's been billions of years in the past, and there's going to be billions of years in the future. Nothing's going to really change other than what we see happening today. Now, we can't go back in the past, and we can't go into the future. We really can only observe today. But how do we know very distinct, enormous geological events haven't happened in the past? Because the Bible tells us they have. That's all the worldwide flood is, a model to understand geology. But then the verse goes on to make two pertinent observations. That the world that now existed was made out of water. Basically, it's a direct reference to creation, and the world that then existed perished, being flooded by water. It's a direct reference to the flood. The two things that scoffers will ridicule in the last days are anybody who say they believe in a literal creation of this universe, this globe, this planet, and life by God, and anybody who says they believe in a literal worldwide flood has happened on this planet in the past. It won't be tolerated by those people. That's exactly where we live today. Now, it hasn't always been that way. For thousands of years, every culture in the world had some story of some God to explain where everything came from. They believed in a creator. And every culture in the world, here's a chart where the Alaska Eskimos, the Polynesians, the Russians, the Egyptians, the Australian Aborigines, the South Americans, no matter what culture you go to, you dig back into their history, they have a story of a flood. There's been a universal acknowledgement of a flood, usually in the story brought by God in judgment of mankind's sin up on this globe. So it's been the universal pattern, acknowledgement of a creator, acknowledgement of a flood for easily 4,000 years of human history. And it's only been in the last 100 or so years those two events are being denied. We literally are living in what God tells us are the last days. We need to be very busy helping people understand the credibility of God's word. It means what it says, and it's trustworthy and it's pertinent because sin is judged. That's why people don't want to talk about the flood. It means God judges sin, and we had better have accepted Jesus Christ as our Lord in payment for that sin, because that's the only way Jesus says we will come back into fellowship with the Father. No one comes to the Father except through me. That's his statement. I hope you'll consider these things as you look at the evidence that there has been a flood, and God, as a just, holy God, does judge sin. In each of these sessions, I've tried to answer one critical question. If this evidence for creation is so strong, if God's word is so obvious, and that's what he tells us, the evidence for creation makes it obvious that he is creator, how can very intelligent, very smart people not see this evidence? How can they miss it? How can they misinterpret it so badly? How can they throw millions of years of history into something which happened only 4,500 or so years ago? That's when God puts the worldwide flood as having happened. Well, there's one more learning from Mount St. Helens that I think sheds an incredible light on that exact question. You see, when Steve Austin was scuba diving down in Spirit Lake, he happened to look up and he saw a lot of trees that were bobbing up and down in a vertical direction. It's like often one end would get more waterlogged than the other, or the root bundle would be heavier, so it would pull it vertical, and like a buoy floating in the ocean, it would just be bobbing up and down in the lake. Matter of fact, as you look over the surface of the lake, you can see trees standing upright in this original floating vegetation mat. As a matter of fact, they did sonar mapping of the lake, and they just did one area and statistically expanded it. They believe there are at least 10,000 trees that sunk and were standing in a vertical position at the bottom of the lake. Now, Steve Austin saw this, And he immediately realized how it connected with something he had been taught throughout his geology classes. There was a classic area in Yellowstone National Park called Specimen Ridge. And in this particular area, there was even a park sign there that was there for decades that showed the same picture that we find in these geology textbooks. And it's a picture of this very steep layer of sediment that goes up about 800 or more feet above the valley. And sticking out of these layers are petrified trees in a vertical direction, except they've all been broken off. Now the explanation that is given in the textbooks is that Yellowstone has always been a very geologically active area, and over the eons of time, a forest grew very low down in the sediment layers that were slowly building up in the Yellowstone Valley. And this volcanic eruption just snapped off an entire forest of trees, like it did at Mount St. Helens, just snapped them off and sent them tumbling, where they would lay and rot and become more soil. Well, over time, and it may have taken hundreds of years, it may have been 1,000 years, a new forest would grow. And these are very large, mature trees. Some of them, again, are 3, 4, 5 foot in diameter, and they've been turned to solid rock, standing in a vertical position. Another forest would form, and then another volcanic eruption, and thousands of trees would die, and a new layer would form, and then another forest would grow. 1,000 years later, another forest. 1,000 years or more later, another forest. Well, they have documented and counted 32 subsequent forests in this to form this enormously thick, 800 or so feet high ridge of sediment with trees at the bottom reaching all the way to trees at the top. And it's explained this is absolute proof that the earth couldn't be 6,000 years old. It has to be at least 30 to 100,000 years old for all of these subsequent layers of trees to have formed. Now, geology students from the early 1900s all the way up into the 1980s see this in a textbook, they see it in museums, park visitors, they see it on the park sign, and they assume it's taught as a fact. It makes total sense. There doesn't seem to be any other possible explanation, and they become convinced the Bible couldn't possibly be true. There is the irrefutable evidence right in front of me. You can go out and you can touch these trees, you can measure them, you can feel them, you can see them. Subsequent forest after subsequent forest prove the Bible can't be right, to the point they become blind to any other possibility. Except what Dr. Austin realized is that here at Spirit Lake is a little model of that. Trees are dropping down while sediment is forming, and as they drop, they end up landing at different layers, different levels. So there may be a tree that's buried very deep with its roots down, and then 10 foot of sediment may form and another tree lands and it gets stuck and sediment builds up around it and it remains standing vertical at another layer. And he realized that's a better model for how these trees could have formed. As a matter of fact, previous researchers, Dr. Harold Coffin and others, they'd been studying this area for years, and along with Steve, they presented evidence after evidence to the geological authorities that this couldn't have been huge periods of time in multiple subsequent forests. You see, statistically, these trees are laying in the same general direction. You wouldn't have had forest after forest after forest where the trees all fall in the same direction. But an enormous flood flow event could have had a general flow direction lining them up in a general similar direction. Trees from different layers, the tree rings were looked at, the fossilized tree rings, and they noticed they had the same general pattern, meaning they couldn't have been from different forests. You see, as you look down this hillside, and that is a very far way down into that valley, that is an enormous amount of sediment that would have had to have settled to have formed this ridge. It all had to have formed at once. Those trees are all from the same catastrophic event that were flowed into this area. They just dropped out at different levels, probably over a matter of days or weeks, not over thousands and thousands of years. And this entire enormous sediment layer formed rapidly, and that's what the evidence shows. But when people become so blinded with a certain philosophical viewpoint, they can't even see the evidence when it's right in front of their face. You understand The evidence that was used to totally undermine people's trust in the Bible for over 100 years has turned out to be a total misinterpretation. That park sign has now been removed because they know it's wrong, but they haven't replaced it with a sign that said, look at this enormous ridge filled with petrified trees. It had to have formed rapidly and recently during a worldwide flood flow event because people aren't trained to think in those terms. Every word of the Bible is literally true. It gives us the model we need to understand the very rocks we walk on. And it will give the people around us the trust they need to acknowledge who God is, to understand that sin brings death. That's what these rock layers represent, the death of trillions of creatures as a result of our sinfulness, and hopefully bring them into a repentance and a relationship with the Creator God who made them and loved them enough that He would die in their place. Take that message to the people around you. It will make a difference in their lives.
Several times in this lesson, we've mentioned fossils. Now, when people hear the word fossil, they immediately think of evolution and they think of enormous periods of time. But actually, fossils and the very characteristics of fossils are very phenomenal evidence supporting a biblical viewpoint of how these animals and plants became trapped in the sediment which turned into the rock layers of the earth. Scientists recently uncovered bacteria which they dated in layers of the earth, which was believed to be 250 million years old. Now, all of these dating methods, this 250 million years, is based on assumption. There's no time machine. There's no way of going back to see this bacteria being captured. But based on various assumptions, they actually stated as a fact that this bacteria was 250 million years old. But they were astounded and totally surprised by several things they found. First of all, they discovered that much of the DNA which was in this bacteria had not yet degraded. Now, we know how fast DNA degrades. We can test it in a laboratory, and it is literally scientifically impossible for even fragments of DNA to remain undegraded and testable, decodable after 250 million years, even after several million years, and yet it was there. So that was an enormous surprise, which testifies not to the ancient age of this bacteria, but to the recent encapsulation of this bacteria. But second, as they started to decode this DNA, they discovered that it was essentially equal or equivalent in its coding to modern bacteria. In other words, there had been no evolution of this single-celled organism for a supposed 250 million years. Now, life on Earth supposedly, if you look in the textbooks, started in the range of 500 million years ago on Earth with the first single-celled organisms. So here you have a creature almost half that old, which has changed not an iota in half the entire lifetime of life here on this planet. While other single-celled organisms are supposedly going all the way from bacteria to multicellular organisms to worms to corals and fish and amphibians and dinosaurs and birds and mammals and monkeys all the way to people over that same period of time, while other bacteria aren't changing at all. Now, this is astounding evidence that the other story, the story of bacteria turning into people, is absolute fantasy. Because what we really see are bacteria trapped in ice layers or rock layers which haven't changed at all. That is reality. That's what we have in our hand that we can see, test, and feel. The whole story of bacteria turning into people, evolution, is just a fanciful story. But the fossils testify to far more than just the stasis or the static nature of creatures. They also show across the spectrum of every phyla or basic body type of life this unchanging characteristic we've seen through time. Lots of variety in the past, lots of variety in the present, but a very distinct maintaining of those very similar body structures. Now let me give you an example. Before the 1930s, there was a type of fish that had been found frequently fossilized in the rock layers called the coelacanth. Now if you looked in textbooks in the late early 1900s, you would see this fish presented as a link between fish and land animals because this kind of fish had bones that went all the way out into the fins of the fish. It was believed to be a kind of fish that lived very near the shore, kind of testing how it felt to crawl out of the waters and start to crawl onto the land surfaces. So the coelacanth was proposed as the link between fish and amphibians, or fish and land animals, and commonly taught as the missing link in that lineage between sea creatures and land creatures. Well, what completely astounded scientists was in 1938, a fisherman in the Indian Ocean, deep down in the ocean where his nets were 1,000 feet or more below the surface, brought up a live coelacanth fish that looked exactly like the fossil remains. Now, it had been taught that this fish had not been around for the last 50 million or so years, and yet here's a live animal that looks exactly like the fossilized animal. Now, they coined a term for this. The coelacanth became known as a living fossil. Now, that doesn't mean the fossils can come back alive. It means there has been no change in a creature over supposedly 50 million years. Now, the 50 million years is fantasy. What has actually happened is those coelacanths alive before the flood were buried in massive quantities along with all the other kind of creatures as sediment washed into the oceans, extinctions happened, and their fossils became buried. Some of those creatures survived, and they went on to repopulate the oceans afterwards. But this fish was nothing like a kind of fish that was about to crawl up onto the land. It only lives very deep in the ocean layers. That's why they weren't commonly known. Unless they happened to be captured at a very deep level, no one would ever see a coelacanth, and yet they're still alive today, an exact representation of the animal that was created by God early on in creation. But it's not just the coelacanth. It's not just the bacteria. Throughout the fossil record, in every basic body structure, we find creatures that look exactly like what we find today. For instance, horseshoe crab. Here you see a fossil of a horseshoe crab. Right beside it, there's a fossil of a living horseshoe crab. No change over supposedly 60 to 100 million years. If you look at starfish, here's a fossil captured in the rock layers supposedly at the time of the dinosaurs. Here's a living starfish captured at the same time. Other sea creatures, sea biscuits. Now that's not something you would want to take and have a bite of along with your potatoes and gravy, but it's a very specific shellfish kind of creature with a star kind of pattern on it. Here's a fossilized sea biscuit. Here's a living sea biscuit. Then we find trees, magnolia trees, gorgeous trees we find all over the southern United States with large green waxy leaves. They burst out in enormous beautiful white flowers. Here's a magnolia leaf from the fossil record. Exactly the same leaf found living today. No change over millions of years. Ash trees, sassafras trees, almost all modern trees we can find leaves, their impressions captured in the fossil record look exactly like the same tree living today. Where is the evolution? Evolution is a fantasy. We see the sudden appearance of very different body structures in these rock layers, and then we find the same sort of creatures, by and large, found today. Fossilized alligators. Fossilized ones, living ones. Fossilized turtles look exactly like living turtles. Insects like cockroaches or dragonflies. The fossil form and the alive form today. No evolution apparent. You see, fossils are one of the greatest friends of a biblical creation-believing scientist because they show evolution is a fantasy. Supposedly, while these creatures are all staying the same Enormous amounts of evolution are going on to create other kinds of creatures. But that's not what we see. We see variations already built into the DNA code of a creature, but we never see new, completely different body structures appearing. Those body structures were apparent way back early on in the fossil record. Now, there have been many creatures that went extinct because the worldwide flood totally devastated this planet. And many creatures that used to be alive are no longer around today. And it's those fossils that get linked up and lined up just in a fanciful story to try to pretend one animal has turned into another. But it's a misinterpretation of the data, not a demonstration of evolution ever having happened.